Connor is asking, what are your thoughts on test strategy for an agile environment where modern/progressive approaches are encouraged compared to a traditional environment? Excellent question. What do you think, Huib?
Okay, so Connor talks about, because and I have to confess this, I was reading through the questions, and Connor's question was on top a couple of hours ago. So I actually sent him a LinkedIn message to ask him what this modern progressive thing was. And what he said is the modern testing principles, or the stuff that's in the books by Lisa and Janet. So basically what I got from that is that how does a test strategy is different in an agile way of working, where modern ways of working are being used versus the traditional one. And I think there's none. I think test strategy in both areas are the same. The context is different. So the things that you have to deal with are different. And the time span is very different, because in traditional ways of working, you have a project of a year and you have a 3 or 4 months testing period, and you write a test strategy for that period, where you haven't seen the product yet, and you haven't seen the and you start working on your planning and your strategy based on what's written in documents. So the way to approach a test strategy is, and the way to make it is different, but the concept stays the same. It's, in both cases, it's what and how. So what are you going to test and how are you going to test it? But the time span is way shorter. And I think if you have a lot of time, you have a lot of time to think about what to test and how you're going to test it. And in an agile way of working, you have less time. So if you look at the document you might want to make, or the visualization of your test strategy, it will probably look completely different.
Okay.
Does that answer the question?
How do you think it would be different? Like, what are the ways it would typically be different in those two different contexts?
And I have a hard time answering this, because my last real traditional project was, I don't know, 12, 15 years ago.
You lucky devil.
and I haven't been working with a lot of huge, big traditional projects ever since. Although I worked at a bank, and that was not that was only like 8 years ago, and we had some huge projects there, and the test strategy that they wrote basically was a master test plan, a huge pile of paper with a lot of fluffy stuff that nobody would read. And I made one when I was test manager for a project in, I think, 2002, 70 pages with everything in it. Who's responsible for what, time planning, procedures, policies. And when I look back at that document, my test strategy part in that document was like 3-4 pages long. So there were 60 pages of logistics and planning and stuff that nobody really would read. And the strategy part was high level. Like, yeah, we're going to do system testing, and we're going to do integration testing, we're going to do acceptance testing, and mentioning the environments and stuff. But what we were going to do was not there. And we did a risk analysis, but it wasn't a really thorough one, and wasn't even detailed enough to use. So I always wondered, why are we writing these documents? But people expect it from you, and you do it. And in an agile environment, that's why I think it's different, is we don't have time to write fluffy documents. So that's the good part. And we really need to think about test strategy, because in agile environments, developers, testers, information analysts, even the ops people are working closely together. And a test strategy will answer the question, how are we going to collaborate? What part of testing will be done in unit tests. So what risks are we mitigating in the unit tests? What risks are we dealing with in system testing, if you still call it that way? Because for me, in Agile, I tend to not use those names again. And we're back to, it's a system test. The tester should do that. And the whole team is responsible for testing. So to answer your question as concrete as possible, without because a test strategy is very context dependent. So without mentioning any context, I think there is no difference in the concept you do. You still talk about how and what to test, but since the time frame is shorter and people are more collaborative, and modern tooling, modern technology, also modern programming languages, and even IDEs give us a lot of opportunities to do different things while we're developing software. Doing all these all those refinements and all these planning sessions and sprint reviews gives us opportunities to talk about the quality of the product, but also the quality of the work we do, the collaboration we do. So I think the role of testing in these projects have changed, and but the strategy itself didn't really change. The concept of strategy, the content of strategy, of test strategy, absolutely is completely different.
Okay.
But it's really hard to talk about the content of a strategy without having context, because I think a test strategy is highly context dependent.
Got it. Okay, awesome. Thank you for that question, Connor.